Hi everyone, this is Phil Travis, and this is the second presentation on World War II. And this particular presentation, we will consider the end of the war, and particularly the Pacific theater in the end of the war. And we will also be taking a look, particularly at the American side of things in the Pacific theater, the realities of the Pacific theater, and some of the long-term significance for the Pacific theater, particularly with relation to developments of independence movements in Indochina or Vietnam, which will eventually develop into the Vietnam War, and also the ramifications for the usage of the atomic bomb on Japan. So, this map, I wanted to just show you this map to give you a look at and an idea of the many different empires that were involved in this area of the world at the outset of the war. Scholars today are generally in agreement on one basic issue when it comes to World War II in the Pacific, and that is that the war was largely the long-term consequence of a collision of empires. The United States, after expanding with manifest destiny across its continent, the United States, after the Civil War particularly, began an expansion into the Pacific, establishing territories in Hawaii, in Guam, ultimately, um, and other Pacific islands that you can see here. As the United States pushed across the Pacific, of course, um, other European powers had colonized other parts of Asia. Many of these colonizations occurred the um, in the 1800s, and of course, the United States most notably took the Philippines from the Spanish, and the Spanish had colonized the Philippines in the 1500s. But you can see the French, of course, in Vietnam and Southeast Asia, the British in the yellow, the Dutch in the orange, and of course the Japanese in the red. The Japanese, in particular, being really modeled after the example of Western European and American colonialism and imperialism, Japan sought to become a great empire. Japan's motivations were directly linked to the um, the examples that were set by all of the other European powers that were colonizing this part of the world. And so Japan sought to become a great world power, just as during the Spanish American War, when Teddy Roosevelt largely um, helped to lead the United States into war with Spain. Teddy Roosevelt viewed the United States as needing to become a great world power, and to do this meant to take colonies. And Japan understood the same thing. And so Japan had for some time expanded into the islands of the Pacific, establishing its own empire. And of course, when World War II began, it was really a strategic decision on the part of Japan when the attack on Pearl Harbor came to beat the United States quickly rather than to allow this collision of empires to result in a war that the United States could be more prepared for, if you will. Um, so Japan's attempt to become a great empire in the Pacific, as you can see on the map, necessarily comes at the consequence of a number of different imperial territories, the British, the French, and the Americans, of course. And after Pearl Harbor, of course, the Philippines were the first place the Japanese went, defeating the forces of MacArthur rather easily, as Douglas MacArthur was caught unprepared. Why do the Japanese want an empire? Well, of course, they want to be a great power. They want to be a great world power of naval strength and economic strength in the region. Japan's a modernizing country, just like other countries in the world, but one thing that makes Japan very unique, especially when you compare it to the United States, is that Japan needs resources. They lack fossil fuels. And so their push into the areas of the Dutch East Indies and the Philippines and Southeast Asia, this was driven largely out of a desire for resources and the establishment of a strategic empire. So in June of 1942, barely 6 months since the Pearl Harbor attack, or just over 6 months, the United States turned the tide in the Pacific at the Battle of Midway. And this was June 3rd through 6th, 1942. And the reason that it really turned the tide was because the American naval force, which had been intercepting and interpreting the Japanese radio codes, were able to effectively catch the Japanese carriers off guard. We sank 3 of Japan's most important carriers, and you can see them in the image here, smoking from below. And these are, of course, carrier aircraft planes that you're looking at. The wings fold, and they flew from other American planes. This was a carrier battle. It was kind of symptomatic of a new age in naval warfare. Wars had historically been determined, at sea by ships of the line, gunships, battleships in the 20th century. But World War II became largely a war of the aircraft carrier. And when we sunk the 3 most significant of the Japanese aircraft carriers like the Soryu, the Akagi, for example, it really stopped Japan's offensive push. Most historians consider it the turning point of the war in the Pacific, the point at which Japan's offensive capabilities were no longer present, and the United States slowly began to win a war of attrition against the Japanese. So it was a turning point, a very significant moment in the war, and primarily because of the Japanese suffering such heavy losses to their aircraft carriers. In the Pacific, whereas in the European theater, your main kind of characters in terms of leaders are, Dwight D. Eisenhower, who's Supreme Allied Commander, of course Patton, General Montgomery for the British. But in the Pacific theater for the United States, your main personalities are Admiral Chester Nimitz and Douglas MacArthur. Douglas MacArthur, shown with the corncob pipe in his mouth. Douglas MacArthur was probably the most flamboyant of American generals. He liked the spotlight, and he kind of was your stereotypical, I guess, rock star general. He was a bit of a showboater, and he liked the spotlight. Let's say that. He was very instrumental in jungle fighting in New Guinea and the Philippines. He was on the Philippines when the Japanese attacked. After the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor, they immediately turned, and within a day and a half, they were attacking the Philippines. I think it was 19 hours, to be honest with you, but they immediately turned and attacked the Philippines. And MacArthur was caught by surprise, and of course, he fled the island, and what was left of his troops, unfortunately, surrendered, and many of which were forced onto the infamous Bataan Death March. Admiral Chester Nimitz, in the painting below, was also famous for creating the strategy of island hopping. Island hopping means that you have to unseat the Japanese who were on many islands. And the only way you could really do this was because you couldn't hit every single island. It would be impossible. And so they had to pick and choose the most significant places to fight. And it became known as island hopping. And so you would hit the islands probably that had the most troops, or had the best ports, or had good runways for bringing supplies. And so you had to hit the most important islands. And the Pacific theater is a largely amphibious type of war, and a jungle war. It's very different than the European theater. This map, if you want to go back and look more closely at it, this is a map of the many battles and operations fought in the Pacific theater. It's not all of them, but it's a lot of them. Fighting in the Pacific, and here's another one of these pro-war advertisements. You can see just from that, you can see the kind of racism that is inherent in how we characterize our enemy. The Pacific theater was brutal. It was, to a large degree, a race war. Both sides effectively viewed themselves as the highest level of civilization. The Japanese often refused to surrender, and oftentimes Americans refused to take prisoners. The death toll in the Pacific theater was 10-1 Japanese to American casualty rates. Many theaters became associated with the Japanese fighters using cave systems as a way of entrenching in the island and being incredibly difficult to defeat. and they oftentimes would not surrender. So you saw a very brutal theater with flamethrowers and amphibious landings, and by the end of the war, the latter stages of the war, even many cases of kamikaze pilots. Some kamikaze pilots, by the way, were forced to do it. Some were strapped into their planes. Some kamikazes were actually liberal arts students like me. Well, I'm not a student, of course, like you guys. You guys are students, but I was a liberal arts student, historian, obviously. But you know, some of these types of people were actually conscripted to be kamikazes against their will in some cases. So you see particularly a very violent end to this war in in a theater that has tremendous casualties as a result. The United States' war in Asia was throughout aided by Asian allies. Pictured here in military attire is Chiang Kai-shek. Chiang Kai-shek was the leader of the Nationalist Party in China. He fought against the forces of Mao Zedong before, during, and after World War II, the communist forces of Mao Zedong. Chiang Kai-shek ultimately is defeated, of course, by the Chinese in 1949, by the Maoist Chinese, and pushed off to the island of Taiwan. Interestingly, the United States recognized the island of Taiwan as the legitimate government of China until the 1970s. And of course, today, the United States recognizes Taiwan as an independent state, and this is disputed, of course, by the Chinese communists. But Chiang Kai-shek aided the United States in the war against the Japanese in China, and Chiang Kai-shek had been fighting, as I said, for some time against the communist forces of Mao Zedong in his attempt to unify the country, and of course, he was a strong American ally during the war. Ho Chi Minh, pictured here. Ho Chi Minh was the Vietnamese nationalist leader who fought the French, and fought the French in a way as an anti-colonial nationalist before the war, and then fought the French quite literally after the war. And he also fought the Japanese in Vietnam. Ho Chi Minh, of course, if anybody knows anything about the history of the Vietnam War, this will probably come to some surprise. Ho Chi Minh was, during World War II, an ally of the United States, and he was used in fighting the Japanese and helping the Americans with downed pilots in the region. We provided Ho Chi Minh with radio equipment, small arms. We treated him medically for dysentery and saved his life at one time when the OSS, which OSS means Office of Strategic Services. It's a precursor to the CIA during World War II. But the OSS Deer Mission, as it was called, had famously parachuted in, met with Ho Chi Minh, treated him for dysentery. We helped to train some of the first 250 to 300 Viet Minh guerrilla fighters. In the French Indochina War after World War II, they were called the Viet Minh. Later, we will call them the Viet Cong. Ho Chi Minh was a communist, but as members of the OSS would testify to after the fact, he was a nationalist first and a communist second. And what that means really is that Ho Chi Minh, what he was most interested in was ending colonialism and ending Western influence, Western-led influence in his country, and creating an independent nation for the Vietnamese people. That was his primary motive. And he thought communism would be probably the best thing for his country. Ho Chi Minh was never, he never fought what becomes what known as the Vietnam War out of an interest of leading a global conquest of communism. You know, Ho Chi Minh is motivated by creating an independent nation for his people, and he appealed quite directly and consistently to the United States. He wrote letters to Harry Truman. Harry Truman never read these letters because he had bigger fish to fry, so to speak. He had bigger concerns and really didn't have a policy on Vietnam. When Ho Chi Minh, at the end of the war, when Ho Chi Minh declared independence in 1945 after the Vietnamese had been defeated, Ho Chi Minh actually directly quoted the United States Declaration of Independence and had the band play the Star Spangled Banner. And actually, the Vietnamese people who were there actually tell a story of when a OSS plane did an overflight of the crowd, which was several 100,000 that gathered in Hanoi to listen to Ho Chi Minh. and everybody thought it was the French coming to strafe them, and it was an OSS plane, and everybody rose their hands and cheered. So a very interesting thing that America, the United States, perhaps at one time had a chance to be an ally with Ho Chi Minh, and we were an ally with Ho Chi Minh during World War II in the fight against the Japanese. Of course, and this is just to make a long story short, but what ultimately happens is the United States will choose to back the French in the French Indochina War rather than Ho Chi Minh. And the reason for this, and this is in the 40s, the French Indochina War began in 1946, and it was an attempt by the French to recolonize Vietnam. And the reason the United States chooses to side with the French largely is because of a concern with communism in the 40s, but particularly a concern with communism at that time in Europe. We were deeply afraid of communism sweeping across Western Europe, and France had communists in political parties, and we were very afraid that a weakening of the economy and the political will in France could result in France and other Western countries falling to communism. And that was something in the 40s that we could not accept. And so the United States ultimately supports the French. And then, of course, over time, by the late 40s and the early 50s, as you have the Korean War and China falling to communism, the United States increasingly interprets Vietnam in the sense of kind of a global containment policy, containment of communism. And this is when the United States really begins its war against Ho Chi Minh. But during World War II, they were allies of convenience, if you will. The end of the Pacific was really a war of attrition, much in the way that World War I was a war of attrition. Of course, it was a war of attrition in Europe, too. It was a war of attrition, period. But Japan kind of whittled down slowly. We completely destroyed their merchant shipping with unrestricted submarine warfare. The United States did. Japan had completely run out of pilots. By 1944, they really had no naval ability whatsoever outside of a few ships and some submarines. They were literally just kind of slowly being beaten to the point of unconditional surrender. In March of 1945, the United States firebombed Tokyo, which killed about 83,000. Firebombing is effectively using incendiary devices to basically light the air on fire. Very devastating kind of warfare. It was used by the British in places like Dresden, Germany, and the United States uses it against the Japanese. Okinawa, which this image that you see here was an image that I took in Okinawa. That's a pillbox or a machine gun bunker. I actually crawled down inside of it, but I didn't include that picture because I was crawling down inside the machine gun turret. But anyway, it just wasn't a very good picture. Let's just put it that way. I had a funny look on my face or something. Anyway, but Okinawa was one of the big reasons why the United States decides to drop the atomic bombs, because Okinawa was very intense fighting. There was something like 50,000 Japanese killed. People committed suicide by jumping off of cliffs. In many cases, people fought to the death. It was a gritty, grueling battle on Okinawa. Americans had to, in some cases, execute prisoners. And it encouraged the United States to use the atomic bomb to end the war. Now, the United States demanded unconditional surrender, and that demand goes back to the Atlantic Conference as well. Unconditional surrender basically meant in Europe and in the Pacific that the United States would only accept the complete surrender, basically allow them to occupy Japan and obtain the complete and total surrender of Japan. And that meant that you're going to have to find a way to fight on mainland Japan or get another method for obtaining the surrender from the Japanese. The Japanese had offered conditional surrenders at this time. Particularly, they wanted to leave the emperor in place and avoid the occupation of the home islands. But they had offered, prior to the bombing, the Hiroshima bomb and the Nagasaki bomb, they had offered very, very reasonable in terms of the United States perspective, conditional surrender options. But the United States felt that it had to go through with its demand of unconditional surrender. This is a look inside one of the tunnels in Okinawa. The Admiralty were down in these coral caves that they created. Ultimately, they committed suicide there. And when you go to Okinawa, you can tour these caves, and it's pretty fascinating. This is an image of Tokyo after the 1945 firebombing. Um, Devastated, 83,000 people. Um, Most of the buildings were wood, and so um, they burned, and it was very awful. And there's horror stories of people who survived by getting in the water, as you see there, and breathing through straws and things like that as the place was engulfed with flames. Of course, the Manhattan Project, the U.S. atomic weapons project that resulted in the successful usage of 3 bombs during World War II. Obviously, the first bomb was detonated as a test in the New Mexico desert in White Sands in July of 1945, and this was called the Trinity test. The atomic bomb became really the reason, or became the way that the United States hoped that it could achieve its goal of unconditional surrender. The United States sought a total surrender of Japan and an occupation of the home islands. And so it was a decision for the United States really between invading the home islands or ultimately using the atomic bombs. Harry Truman did not even know about the atomic bombs when he became president. Here you see pictured Little Boy, which is the second atomic bomb ever detonated. The first, of course, detonated in combat over Hiroshima on August 6th, 1945. There were 3 locations used in the creation of these bombs: Oak Ridge, Tennessee, Los Alamos, New Mexico, and of course nearby Hanford, Washington. We built both a plutonium bomb and also a hydrogen bomb. I mean, a hydrogen bomb, a plutonium bomb, and also a uranium bomb. The hydrogen bomb, guys, was not actually completed until and tested until 5 years later. So we create a plutonium bomb and a uranium bomb. They both looked rather different in nature, and of course they are unique in the level of devastation that they can bring. This is the plane, the B-29, the B-29 that dropped the bomb in Hiroshima. The first bomb dropped in combat. It was piloted by Lieutenant Colonel Paul Tibbets, and of course, this is a B-29, and it flew ultimately from the island of Tinian-Delahey and ultimately over Hiroshima on August 6th, 1945. So only 3 days after the Hiroshima bombing, and of course Hiroshima was a devastating bombing. As you see the statistics there, Hiroshima bombed flattened 4 square miles. 100,000 people died in a relatively short time frame. 3 days afterwards, they dropped another bomb on August 9th, 1945, on Nagasaki. So Hiroshima was dropped on August 6th, and of course Nagasaki on August 9th. One of the great questions that historians have had to struggle with and deal with is the question of, was the usage of the atomic bomb necessary? The United States had a position of unconditional surrender. This was a policy that we established with both Germany and Japan at the Atlantic Conference in 1942. And the unconditional surrender suggested that the United States would only accept absolute total surrender of the Axis powers and the occupation of their lands. Some have questioned whether or not unconditional surrender was necessary, because oftentimes it's couched as it was either this or invading the home islands. But historians have questioned whether or not unconditional surrender was actually the right approach, or that it may have unnecessarily prolonged the war. The Japanese had, of course, made surrender offers to the United States, and before the usage of these bombs, Japan appealed to the Soviet Union as a potential intermediary in negotiations to end the war without an occupation of the home islands. So there's a lot of debate among historians whether or not the atomic bomb was the right choice. It resulted in absolutely just atrocious human devastation. 100,000 people died in Hiroshima, around 80,000 died in Nagasaki. And of course, that doesn't count for long-term issues with birth defects, leukemia, other forms of cancer, and so on. So it's a devastating thing. And of course, it unleashes on the world the technology of ultimately nuclear warfare, which perhaps that's inevitable, but nonetheless, the construction and usage of these weapons unearths this technology, and the consequences for that are obviously huge. Nuclear proliferation today remains perhaps the greatest concern in terms of global foreign policy. Now, I also say that this is often something that's difficult for Americans to think of. World War II becomes a conflict for Americans that is highly romanticized. And as a result of this, oftentimes our ability to critique it is lost. And historians, of course, will critique it quite heavily, but everyday Americans would probably not see the war in terms, for example, of the issue of race in the conflict, at least in the Pacific theater, and they would probably view the atomic bombings through a less critical lens, as though it was simply necessary and there was no other choice. And the reality was there were other choices, and this was the choice that was made. And whether or not it was the right choice is something that really historians don't fully agree on. Anyway, I hope this is helpful, and I hope this helps. And I have a song here if you want to listen to one of Johnny Cash's great songs about, I suppose, one of the more unlikely American heroes during World War II. I would ask, copy and paste that to your browser and have a listen. That's a really great song. It's about a great Native American who fought at Iwo Jima, Ira Hayes, and was sort of forgotten by his country. And so there's kind of a lasting message about how the United States, in some cases, treats its people. Anyhow, I hope this is helpful, and let's have a great week.